Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at the School of Design lecture series. I am so happy to introduce you to Waqas Jawaid and Andy Chen, co-founders and partners of Isometric Studio in Brooklyn and married life partners as well. We've invited Waqas and Andy to Carnegie Mellon on nomination from our undergraduate program in the School of Design. Isometric creates spaces of belonging using the languages and tools of graphic design and architecture. The studio is living proof of how design can bring values of inclusion, equity, and justice to bear. Andy Chen holds an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and Graphic Design, where he was a Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow. He worked at Pentagram and was also a Fulbright Scholar at the Royal College of Art in London. Waqas holds a Master's of Architecture with distinction from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and has worked for Office for Metropolitan Architecture, SANA, Harvard Art Museums, and Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And I'm personally very excited to invite these people who I know. I met Waqas and Andy when we were all at Princeton when Waqas and I were in the School of Architecture. I was a PhD student and he was an undergraduate. In fact, he ended up in a section of a course that I was a teaching fellow for. And Waqas there received highest honors in architecture. Andy was a sociology student who won the Pine Honor Prize, which was the highest general undergraduate distinction. And I always think of Waqas in class and the drawings that he was producing. They were extraordinary. There's always something going on under the pencil, under the pen, and in the margins of whatever he was thinking through. And here we are now, 12 or 13 years later. We are a little alarmed that it's been that long. And here they are at Carnegie Mellon to share their work, practice, and ethos with us. So please help me to welcome Waqas and Andy from Isometric Studio. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Molly. Thanks for that generous introduction. And we're so excited to be invited and to see you. So we're going to go ahead and get started.
So our studio is a small studio in Brooklyn, New York. We are 7 people now working remotely in the pandemic. Several of our team members are in Brazil and others are in New York. And it's just been a really interesting and fun ride. And we're really glad to be here to share our work with you. So I'm from LA. My parents are from Taiwan, and that immigrant story is really sort of where I think my roots are. My dad grew up in a fishing village with very little money, and when they moved to this kind of like suburban dystopian paradise of like sort of a combination of multiple cultures, that's what I grew up with, and it made me very aware of sort of the context of what visual culture looks like and who's represented and who's not. Meanwhile, Waqas grew up in Pakistan, a place created from partition with India into Muslim country created in the name of religion. And the history of that also sort of haunts our experience. We met at Princeton, where we were both undergraduates, and we met Molly. And this is us when we were really young, all those years ago. And we've both been in a personal relationship for quite a long time, and that eventually led to a professional relationship as well. I worked for Pentagram under Paul Scher, one of my first jobs, and learned about graphic design there, and then got an MFA in graphic design, as Molly said, at RISD, where I started to think about how an undergraduate education in sociology could meld with a career in design, meaning how can we visualize the stories of people who are marginalized on their own terms. And instead of creating these sort of victimizing portrayals that are messianic, thinking about more thoughtful modes of representation that can confer dignity, but without sort of just falling into stereotypes. And meanwhile, Waqas studied architecture at Princeton and then Harvard, and worked for some really important firms like Sana in Tokyo, like OMA in Rotterdam, and then SOM here in the United States. Then decided that after getting a full-time job at SOM, that actually he was going to partner with me and work on Isometric. And today, this is where we operate out of. It's where we're sitting. It's both our home and our studio. And in the pre-pandemic times, people would always come to work here, but now everybody is, of course, working at home. These are some of the folks that we work with. They tend to be institutional clients, universities or museums and so forth. And I'm going to play just a short video that kind of captures the ethos of our work.
So we have a number of case study projects to walk you through and to kind of share the process, the thinking behind them. And we started almost at the very beginning, which is when I joined Andy, and we got a project for the US Agency for International Development. And this was the first time that we had a big enough project that we brought on another team member as part of Isometric. And it really became a studio, it became a collaboration. And when we were first approached for this project, this is the diagram that they had. The goal was to do a biennial exhibition showcasing for a Washington audience all of the amazing work that USAID was doing in terms of development investments. So in addition to urgent aid that they provide to developing countries in need, they also invest a lot of money, US taxpayer money, to make sure that long-term change is happening, and that in turn ensures long-term security for the world and for the US. So this was a place to show both lawmakers and the development community, the nonprofit community, what that work was. And it was a little haphazard. You can see an innovation lounge in the center. And so we had some concerns, but we'll talk about them as we go through. The very next day, we got on the Amtrak and went to Washington, D.C. and saw the site where this would take place. It's a postmodern building with a lot of distractions within this very, very large room, 10,000 square feet. And it's within the Ronald Reagan building, which is the second largest government building in the United States after the Pentagon. And we were given this as an example. This was a design kind of concept created by the Cooper Hewitt that was called Design for the Other 90%. And we had some design-based concerns about what we were seeing that we wanted to question and explore a little bit more. One was that in an effort to show the invention here, which is this water filtration system, the woman is almost shown as a prop or as and in a kind of crouched position, so it doesn't feel super dignified. And then the other is the use of the heavy use of big numbers and statistics, which also tends to take away from the individual stories of people's lives. So we wanted to see how we could do things a little bit differently. So we looked at art and we looked at other examples like JR and how the use of scale in space, putting graphics in space at a huge scale, kind of turns the gaze back to the viewer, and it complicates the relationship between the object or the art and the audience. And we also started thinking about the title of the exhibit, which was supposed to be about eradicating extreme poverty by 2020. And this was back in 2014. And we said, as designers, as people interested in language and branding, if you want to get rid of extreme poverty, what is it that you want to achieve? And so this was our first initial kind of visual concept, where we found really beautiful images by photojournalists that were available, and that were available to license, and typography and language and quotations, and bring it all together into a visual concept. And they absolutely loved it. And they said, instead of doing just the panels with the exhibit, that we could take over the whole room and think about how we might imagine it. And this was really exciting for our studio back then. And then, of course, thinking about the exhibit, we didn't just want it to be a one-liner, extreme hope. We wanted to see how we could take hundreds of projects and kind of curate them in a way that was memorable. So having a limited number of categories or headings under which a limited number of projects would be shared, and a selection would be shared, so it doesn't feel like a high school science fair. And then some of the topics that we proposed were extreme equality. Within equality, there were projects that had to do with digital inclusion, like cell phone apps, gender equality, resilience and rebuilding, the nourishment, health, knowledge. And in terms of the organization of the space within the room that I showed, we were looking at precedents and examples, looking at Lina Bobardi in this case, the museum in Sao Paulo, and how you can have a grid of very organized presentation of materials, but an open system where people can explore in many different ways. So you can have both organization and freedom without resulting in chaos. And then we presented two options, and they wanted sort of a combination. And one option had like 100 posters, and the other option had these giant panels. And so we arrived at something in the middle. And we did some research and figured out that the hardware was available to create these hanging panels that would be 5 feet tall, and they could be unlimited in terms of length. And they would be translucent and really well lit, and that would form the exhibit component that would be really immersive and large scale compared to the visitors as they move through. And within each panel, we wanted to foreground the stories of the people and really give people a sense of what it's like to be collaborators, to be protagonists in their own stories, and to receive this funding as investment, and to basically explore the possibilities of what is possible, when you have resources available. And for the room itself, you can see that they wanted a lot of partner stations. These are nonprofits that are doing work on the ground. And so almost like, like a mall where you have the biggest stores on the ends, we put the partner stations on the ends. That's where the activity would be, most of the people would be. And then in the middle, we have the exhibit. And then we have a stage where you had kind of like TED Talks of people talking about the projects that they're doing, and some other secondary programs. And so, yeah, it happened within 6 weeks. It was really crazy, seeing samples. And then before we knew it, we were had moved to DC for a week and getting this installed. It could only be installed the night before. And as you can see, the title changed from Hope to Progress, because hope was very closely associated with President Obama at the time. And it had to be kind of, bipartisan. And then here you can see some of the images of the event itself. And in the back, we had a super graphic projection where people could really get a sense of the places that were being talked about and that were being influenced by all of this work. And so there's a combination of vertical and horizontal panels, and kind of trying to make the room disappear in this exhibit because it was just so, it had a real presence. And we also formed relationships. This is the first time that we found Pars Designs, which is the carpenter we work with. And then we continue to work with on several exhibitions after this one. And just people who are really, good at what they do and ready to just take a risk and do something exciting with us.
So a lot of our projects at the studio have to do with our alma mater, Princeton. I think that tends to be the case for sort of new small studios. And we were able to sort of form a relationship with the university as vendors, other than just as alumni, when they asked us to work on this project, which is called the Carl A. Field Center for Equality and Cultural Understanding, very long name describing the Center for Students of Color at Princeton. And essentially, Princeton, like most sort of Ivy Leagues and basically East Coast schools during 2014, had a series of student protests, basically with Black students who felt like they were being dehumanized by the system, that they were not being properly represented or seen on campus as like sort of full human beings in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like how could college campuses stop creating this false sort of argument between free speech and people's sort of deeply held values and their presence as full human beings in a context like Princeton that's full of sort of privilege. How can we sort of redress some of the historical injustices? And so students sat in the president's office. Here's an image from Yale where they marched and they said, "We're out here, we've been here, we ain't leaving, we are loved." Students that we interviewed say things like, in environments like Princeton, the kinds of racism or discrimination that you experience will not be easily recognizable to you. And we looked at sort of, we were asked to do the branding first for the center, and we looked at typography from the past. Here on the left, from the Memphis sanitation strike, this sort of strident, large-scale letter forms. On the right, the sort of handwritten appropriation of it that still exists today, and the language, "I am a man." Taking a look at the art of Karita Kent on the left, and a contemporary artist, Jarrett Key, on the right, this idea of tear that reveals an inner condition. And so we chose a typeface that had that sense of sort of the hand, the evidence of the hand, that and the tallness, but had a sense of warmth as well, because it needed to exist as language for a student center. And we couldn't change the name of the center because of political reasons, so we focused on the largest values and just made them really, really big, as big as possible, and also substituted other words that were important to the center other than equality, justice, freedom, action. Created materials like this, posters like this. And these posters, as a campaign, began to tell sort of truths of students who had pretty much been silenced, in the context of this very privileged place, a place where it almost feels like weakness to reveal the pain or the trauma that you might experience because of your identity, and to talk about Black Lives Matter in sophisticated ways. Then the university asked us to look at the physical space, and had already been doing work with an architect called Ballinger in Philadelphia to try to renovate the space, which was previously an eating club that had been converted to a kind of a conference space. The space was not bad. It was designed by Ann Beha architects, in the mid-2000s. And it looked okay, but people just kind of felt like it looked anonymous and like a doctor's waiting room with some trappings of cultural center in the form of posters and rugs. The architect Ballinger was taking this tactic where they divide the rooms into what they called a home. So they had a living room, a dining room, a porch, etc. And then they wanted to install in those rooms African chairs designed by a Dutch designer and Asian pillows. And we took a look at this and we were very concerned. And we told the university that if we were going to work on this project as people of color and as people who have attended Princeton, we would want to avoid shame and embarrassment of the university, because this would sort of lead to sort of accusations of cultural essentialism and appropriation. Very like sort of insensitive architects who really didn't know what they were doing and were just like decorating the space with sort of like stuff from around the world that they found interesting and global. And to us, that was highly insulting. So
putting people in a box in a way, right?
Mm-hmm. And so the university sort of took that in stride and decided that, well, why don't you partner with them to make it work? And so they asked us to apply wall graphics and the language of the visual identity of the center to the space. And so we started thinking about how these brightly colored sort of shapes could exist on the walls. The center director, Tennille Haynes, talked about how these cultural centers are often like always in grayscale. The graphics are always sort of, a reminder of the past, but never trying to create a new future. And so she wanted color, and she wanted bright color. And she wanted like the idea of like the voice of the institution to reflect the voice of students. And so we created models, and here are some images of the final space divided into 3 programs. As you enter, a program called We're Here, which automatically seeds space on the wall of the center to students for their posters. On the right, as you enter, an image of Dr. Carl Fields. Nobody really knew who the namesake of the center was. This is the first Black Ivy League dean. And on the left, you have the words to acknowledge and question race, class, privilege, and culture at Princeton and beyond. As you walk into the space, images of contemporary Princeton's all its multiplicity, and students sort of working together in activism, in celebration, in mourning. Above the bathrooms and water fountains, everyone should feel welcome in every space at Princeton. And the graphics sort of wrap up the space with quotations and collages of images. A second room called We've Been Here, which is a snapshot of the history of people of color at Princeton. So because people have to kind of visit and revisit this space, we didn't want it to become stale in the form of like a sort of linear timeline that we would read. Instead, juxtaposing past and present, you kind of see these moments of sort of real achievement at the university. For example, on the left, an image of Sonia Sotomayor, now the Supreme Court Justice. And on the right, an image of Daniel Padilla Peralta, who was an undocumented immigrant who became the salutatorian in his class and now is an associate professor of classics at the university. In the final room, We Are Loved, creating a platform for activism for students, lined with quotations from around the world of authors who really haven't been represented as often, sort of placing them into the architecture and sort of making their voices heard. And then one big moment in the stairwell that's visible from the outside of the building.
Yeah, this was an interesting moment because when we first were doing the proposal for that project, I had outlined a few walls and I said, this is where the graphics can go. And Andy said, why don't we just take over the whole building? And I'm like, can you do that? And so what we did, we proposed it, and they, we made models and everybody loved them. So this was the first time for me that, we took architecture and just kind of thought about it as a canvas for graphics, for paint, to really activate it and conceptually redefine the meaning of a space so that different kinds of conversations can take place in that previously kind of anonymous space. So the next project is doing that in a slightly different way. It's a more high-key space, also at Princeton. There was some new construction. On the left was a renovated new home for the economics department. And to the right here was a previously exterior courtyard that was turned into an interior atrium. And that was the home of the international programs at Princeton. And they wanted the building to have more of an identity, more of a welcoming sense, both for the community on campus, but also for visitors to feel like this is a truly international space. And this is what that atrium looked like. It had a really tall artwork that was supposed to go in there from Shazia Sikandar. And we started looking at representations of what it means to be international at Princeton. And like many other minorities and communities, including women, LGBT people, etc., initially the focus was how do these diverse kind of students help the education of our core Princeton man, which is a white man, which is traditionally what a Princeton student was. But over time, it's become a lot more nuanced than that. We also looked at some cliches of having lots of flags or having a world map, and we didn't want to do that, or having people holding hands and welcome in different languages. So this is all stuff that we did not want to do. And so our initial idea was to create something that takes up the volume of the empty space above, overhead, and to connect all of these different windows that were looking into the atrium at different levels. People would be viewing this kind of banner installation that would be so fine that it would not really interfere with the artwork, and it would be constantly changing and its shape would be constantly evolving. However, a little bit into the project, we were informed that there are exhaust fans that are so strong in the case of a fire or drill that they would suck this whole thing out. So we had to basically start all over again. And yeah, when we did have this option, we thought that it would have this quote by Tennyson on it. So we started from basically from the beginning, and we started thinking about doing a floor installation. And there were two options that we thought would be exciting. One we called celestial, that involved circles and concentric circles. And the other one was terrestrial, which was about the ground and really the physical nature of the ground. And so circles can be found in all cultures in different forms. And so that was really appealing. And we were looking at different ways of doing floor installations, something that perhaps could be embedded, could be fine but shiny. We thought this was really interesting, putting typography on the ground that people can read as they walk around, something that feels a little ephemeral. And so this is the option that they choose, which was the celestial, that starts at the beginning of the atrium and emanates out, and takes up 3 levels and 7,200 square feet. And inscribed on the floor were quotations by authors from around the world. In the center by Yuri Kochiyama, Decolonize Your Mind, and people from all over the world. Here you can see images of the meeting with the architect, the university architect, the architect of the building, and the facilities folks to talk about the project and to look at the samples and really test to make sure it works. And the technique was to use a very low-cost material, silver vinyl, but then to coat it in 2 layers. First, in epoxy that temporarily turns the porcelain tile glossy. And then the second layer of polyurethane restores the matte appearance. And with those 2 layers, the typography is essentially sealed into the stone forever. So obviously there could be no spelling errors or mistakes in the graphics as they were applied. And we worked with another close collaborator on this, and this is their diagram. And yeah, these very, very fine graphics, very subtle but pervasive, kind of took over the whole atrium. And here you can see how once they've been applied, the epoxy goes on. This is what that looks like. And then the polyurethane restores the appearance of the tile. And yeah, this was one of the most subtle things we've done, but also one of the most permanent set in stone elements. And you can see how as the sun moves throughout the day, different parts of the building kind of light up. And also as you move through the space, certain things come into view and then sort of disappear. So it's very, very unobtrusive, but also very present. And there's many opportunities to discover and rediscover quotes as you move through the building.
So this next project is for the Museum in the City of New York. It was one of our first sort of projects in New York City, museum projects in New York City. And they really just gave us a wonderful opportunity to think about this sort of public health project. So it was called Germ City, Microbes, and Metropolis. And the museum wanted to talk about the history of New York City through the lens of public health. And that's to say, like, how the city cares for people in a pandemic, which is particularly relevant to our moment now. It wasn't so relevant back in 2018. And we were learning all this information anew that we were relearning again because of the pandemic. So they wanted to feature a full-size iron lung, which helped people breathe. And on the right, like large artworks like a blood mirror created by Jordan Eagles from the Blood of Gay Men, basically arguing that gay men should be allowed to donate just like everybody else instead of being discriminated by the federal government because of their HIV status or presumed HIV status. And they wanted to feature a lot of artifacts and reproductions that look kind of scary to us. For example, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a wax moulage of a dead boy with smallpox. And so we were like kind of alarmed once we received this sort of raft of materials. And we thought, okay, so how do you make this accessible to families and kids, right? And one of the museum folk was like, well, why don't we just make it really scary, like a Ripley's Believe It or Not, and then you'll get a lot of people to come. And we were concerned that that might take away a little bit from the story of people who are stigmatized because of disease. That's to say that every time that there's a pandemic, there's always somebody to scapegoat, like whether it's women or LGBT people or the China virus, there's always somebody to point the finger at. And we thought that we should need to find a way to dignify those stories, while at the same time, authentically representing the fear that is associated with disease and the war metaphors that are used to, quote, combat it. And so we looked at Japanese architecture as inspiration here by Junya Ishigami. And to think about like sort of how these organic shapes that already look like microbes could make it cuter. And so like this cute kind of context would sort of allow families and kids to feel like they could go to an exhibit about germs. We also looked at the work of Andrea Bronzi here, sort of representing urbanism as sort of these molecular shapes. And so here's some early conceptual diagrams like that we showed the museum, like it could be like curvy tables around some squares, or it could be a lot of little microbes. They liked this idea, but they thought it was untenable given that they wanted to organize things into themes. It could be one big table, which got a little closer. This kind of like tape-like table was a little too thin for the artifacts, so it got like bigger and more globular in terms of its shape. And they like the idea of one long horizontal surface because most museum exhibits in New York are about the verticality of the city, like we build large walls, or about the grid. And germs don't behave that way. So think about like the diffusion or the miasmic distribution of germs in space, that they don't obey the laws of sort of the city or of human beings. And so it ended up being showing diagrams like this that showed how the artifacts would sort of fit into themes, and each theme would take up a lobe, and the lobe would have objects sort of carefully placed. And here's where it was more further developed by Waqas, where there are just tons of objects on each lobe, and they were each sort of finely calibrated. We showed how graphics could work with the space using these mini models. The table shape is the same in all of them, but the graphics vary. And this is really helpful in the client making a decision and showing them sort of schematics of how the objects would all be protected, and then creating a graphic language here, which didn't directly parallel the shapes because we wanted this one to be more like, okay, how do germs transgress and mutate and morph? This is back when germs were cute and perhaps cool. Now they're scary and frightening. But it's interesting to look back and see sort of how relevant this exhibit was. And here's sort of an unfolded plan with elevations showing the museum, sort of the artifacts and the wall text related to each other. So the wall treatment would speak to the table.
And as you can see, the shapes were kind of defined by whether or not a wheelchair could go through and experience every single object. And so that became a really interesting design opportunity that pushed the project further.
So there was opportunity here to tell like the stories of immigrants, of people of color, of LGBT people in what we thought was a fairly respectful way. Then they asked us to create a room for engagement. So basically the funder, Welcome Collection, wanted, because in the primary gallery, none of the objects could be touched. So they wanted a room where people could open drawers and interact with things. And so we showed various concepts for that. They chose the mini germ tables. So this is like basically the babies of the mother table in the other room, and various interactives. And so then everything was approved, and we sort of tested this idea of gradient paint that would like flow up the walls from a blue floor. And it was kind of crazy, like, but the museum is really game for crazy stuff. And so testing what these tables look like, painting the whole room, which they had never done before. And the installation of the table was just super exciting, like one big shape in the room. And here are some installation views of what the hallway looks like when you enter the exhibit. You encounter this graph that is called The Conquest of Pestilence, issued by New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, to kind of show the progress of the city in combating pandemics. And unfortunately, in 2020, this graph will look very different. As you walk into the room, you're immersed in this laboratory-like space where there's an Ebola suit that greets you, and the floor is blue, and kind of the blue flows up the walls. On the floor are also large supergraphic images of sort of microbes and pests. And on each lobe is a story of sort of microbes in Metropolis, that's say like these objects and artifacts, reproductions, and they're sort of seen in the context of these large artworks, quarantine signs. And here's like a little assemblage of detective work. So this is showing how the city tracks disease, as now we know about contact tracing and stuff, but it actually was birthed in an era where there was not as much technology. And then if contact tracing doesn't work, then how does the city care for people who are ill? Here's the iron lung. Here are postcards showing all the various hospitals in the area. The tubercular lung. Here are images of the reading room gallery where people could sort of be able to lounge and write responses. And sometimes people wrote very moving and emotional responses about their experience with infectious disease. Kids could play.
Okay, thank you. So the next project we're showing is for Google New York headquarters, and they had been doing some research on policing in America, and they wanted to create an exhibition that would educate the team inside of the Google office, and specifically educate them on what the Black experience is like interacting with the police. And so that's when they called us, and one of their goals was to make it kind of tangible and not digital, because these engineers tend to spend a lot of time on the computers, and they wanted to do something in physical space, in their headquarters space in Chelsea. So these are some of the slides that they showed us initially of the work that they had done. And the responses from the Google team were that I didn't learn anything new, like, I don't know what's going on. And the response from us was that it feels kind of like pseudoscientific, and also the photographs don't look very dignified. They look like mugshots almost. So it's not presenting, and also not presenting the visceral sense of what we see when we see police encounters. And even as people who are not Black Americans, like the sense of anger that we experience at the injustice. And then some things like this, which just seemed kind of wrong, like tips on how not to get shot. Like the language was very disrespectful, we thought. So yeah, they were doing a lot of work, but we said that, similar to many of our projects, like you saw in USAID, like how do we tell the story of what's happening, and really show people in all their dignity as protagonists in their own lives. And we said, what if we traveled and met with some of these folks again and interviewed them and took pictures, and that would add another layer to the exhibit. And so they said, okay, and we traveled to 3 cities, Atlanta, Georgia, Oakland, California, and Washington, DC. And we met with 9 participants who had previously been part of this study. And we photographed them in their homes, and we asked them questions and had conversations and recorded those, and got quotations from that. And it was just really illuminating, even for people, the 2 of us and our team who we think are really interested in social justice issues. It was very eye-opening to see the lives of people who obviously did not end up on the news in tragic situations, but go through their lives daily with the threat of police viewing them as a threat. So it's a kind of complicated, but essentially one of the things we heard over and over again was the difference with which their white friends would be treated by the police as somebody who's a real constituent, a citizen who needs protection, and how they were treated, which was with a lack of respect and with inherent suspicion. Laura, for example, said, I would tell the mother of a police officer that a lot of the feelings that she may have about Black males being aggressive and being a threat, I would say a lot of that is sensationalized. I would tell her that my sons are human, they're loved, they're smart, they're intelligent, they're gifted. And this was back in late 2018. So this was before the 2020 events. And still, you could really sense that something was not right. And especially when the men would talk to us, they would use humor in recounting stories of encounter with the police. And, we thought it was because the humor allows you to take back agency in the retelling of that story of trauma. And, we met with people outside of their workplace and parking lots. We met people in places of like their, this was a music studio that this participant frequented a lot. And so that was really powerful. And then we also looked at examples of design of what this exhibition could look like. And here you're seeing the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And this idea of public square becomes really important to us at that point, a place of terror, in the form of slave auctions, but also a place where the story of this nation is kind of negotiated and told and retold. Here you're seeing the set of the musical Hamilton. And a place where messages are put out and the community as a whole decides, what are the values that we hold dear and what is not acceptable to us. So, and then we looked at typography from the civil rights era and graphic design, use of imagery, how this story has been told. We looked at contemporary typefaces that were done in the past few years. Here, for example, by Trey Seals, who leads Vocal Type, is a Black typographer. And then we started thinking about what this exhibit could look like. And we had two options. We usually do two or three options. And out of them, this one was more appealing to the client. And the idea was that there would be these plywood panels that would be interconnected like this and holding each other up. And they would form a central community space where after you experience all the content, it's a place for, in a sense, updating the community discourse around this topic as a collective. So that idea of individual reflection and a community discourse is really important in exhibitions because it's a public space. People see you seeing the content, and that's really powerful. And here is a physical model showing what the exhibition would look like, would feel like. And it was in a corporate kind of, meeting room. But the idea was similar to USA, to kind of try to make the room disappear and to let the content shine. Here is a video showing how the installation happened. Again, in this case, the installation had to happen in one day. You're seeing direct printed plywood panels and wooden framing and openings cut out. And so the stories, the graphic design, comes ready to go, which was really useful in this case.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmony of liberty. Yeah. Let our rejoicing rise higher than the sunshine. Let us march on to victory. Jesus, one. Let it resound as the road. See, oh, let us march on to victory in this world.
So here are some photos of the exhibit. You can see the central table with books. and kind of larger than life portraits of people that tower over you, and information about how the research was done, how the locations were selected. And then this was really important. We wanted there to be an element of literary storytelling and an element of history that would ground the narratives of these participants. So people couldn't just say, oh yeah, you know, I have a Black friend and they're totally fine. That, oh, it's just one person's experience. And the idea is that no, it's not just one person's experience, it's pervasive. And so that was kind of important for this exhibit. And you know, the diversity within the community and how different people's lives were so different from each other. But in many ways, the one thing that united everybody was their encounter with state apparatus as Black Americans. And for us, as people who are not Black, you know, the goal was to kind of bear witness and to tell the truth, and you know, to be allies as best as we can be in telling the history and the story of the community. And they also, I mean, you can see here on this wall, all of the experiences of not just the 9 people we interviewed, but many more that they had interviewed of police encounters. And there was a section where Google asked us to think about what the emotions were like when you were stopped by the police. And you know, we turned those into posters. How, you know, in that brief few seconds where you're pulling over, you have to make sure that your license and registration is already out. Your hands are on top of the steering wheel so that you can reduce the chance of getting hurt as much as possible at the hands of you know, public servants, essentially. And so this room for personal reflection. And then this was the opening where they invited some of the participants of the research to come and share their experiences with the Google community.
So this final section of projects has to do with our own identities as Asian Americans in this country. And a lot of times the stereotype is often that sort of, you know, as Asian designers, you get sort of tasked to do sort of Asian related work. And in some ways, through the beginning of our careers, we really resisted that because we didn't want to be known as the Chinatown designers. At the same time, like I think we started to take ownership of those identities ourselves, and to believe that, you know, part of our goal as a studio is to elevate our own cultures as well. So when we were asked to do this sort of restaurant identity for this Brooklyn restaurant called Rule of Thirds, like we sort of jumped on it first because the folks that were involved were really lovely and fans of design. But second, also being able to, in our own neighborhood, you know, about like a couple blocks away, help create a space for a social space. This opened right before the pandemic, and they have survived and will continue to reopen as the law permits. But just to try to create a visual identity that is about a combination of elegance, but also with a sense of, I think, like joy and
humor. And it's very difficult to do something humorous that is also not stereotyping. So how do you show like Brooklyn hipsters, but without making it look like it's only for a certain class of people? So I think that our team has been really wonderful in like exploring that with us and thinking how you can dignify, you know, a community.
Yeah, but this is one of my favorite projects that we've done, I think, because it's like, though it's not explicitly about sort of social justice in the way that other projects might be, in some ways it kind of like sort of infuses a sense of personality to like a restaurant culture. and it elevates it past like sort of, what we might normally associate with immigrant restaurants without becoming too hoity-toity, right? So there's the risk, like Waqas said, of classism, of course, and there's some of that encoded in this design for sure. And in all design, I think. But at the same time, like thinking about how we can liberate ourselves from sort of binaries and create sort of spaces and visuals that speak to a multiplicity of interests. And even fun things like choking poster.
With one of the co-founders featured in it. So we have 2 more projects, and we're going to go a little bit more rapidly through these. This was in 2019. We worked with the Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum on a new exhibition called Contemporary Muslim Fashions that was actually started at the De Young Museum in San Francisco, and then went to Frankfurt and was coming to New York. And our job was to create all of the graphic design and the architecture to suit the new gallery and the new mission. Here are some images from the San Francisco version of the exhibit, which we thought was really admirable. They had a much bigger space, much taller ceilings, and the focus really was on the fashion, on like turning it into as much as high fashion as possible, I think. And our goal was a little bit different. It was about exploring ideas of inclusion. So this is still San Francisco, a different designer. We didn't design this. And then when it's coming to New York, one of the first things we do for an exhibit that's so extensive is take stock of all of the objects that are going to be in it. And so here's a visual index where every single object is shown in a relative scale proportion to each other. And what was nice was that all the topics and everything was already organized. So that was, although the curators in New York did make some changes. And the gallery was a lot lower in terms of height and very fragmented. So we started looking at the Cordova Mosque because we were looking at Muslim culture. We thought it was really interesting to think about a space that is in plan, a very kind of boring grid, but in actual experience, it's kind of limitless and constantly changing as you move through the space. We also looked at the Long Museum in Shanghai, where half arches are used to create these very interesting dynamic framing of views. And we were looking at semi-translucent fabric panels with fine typography on it. I think this is from the Met. And in terms of graphic design, we were looking at something that was crisp, contemporary, elegant. This is a Saul display typeface from Shiktoika, based in Europe. And we customized the eyes, the dot of the eye, to make it look more like the Arabic eye. And that was pretty much the only subtle hint that this had something to do with Muslim culture. And as somebody who grew up in a Muslim family, this was really close to me. And one thing I was thinking a lot about was the idea of audiences, on how, when you have an exhibit that's at the Cooper Hewitt in New York, the primary audience is going to be predominantly a white audience. So how do we tell the story of the Muslim community to that audience? But at the same time, think of a broader audience of the Muslim community itself as being part of the audience, and all of the other diverse audiences within New York. And so how do we do justice to the stories for all of these people was something that was important to us. And one thing that the Cooper Hewitt requires is this very, very long construction set. So we're going to show you just a few images from that. And this was a rendering of the overall organization of the design. We had 3 options. This is the one that they picked and liked. And we have half arches here, basically the components that I talked about. And in addition, we have these sweeping curves that allow a 3-foot distance from the viewer to the object, which was a requirement, and somehow miraculously fit all of the objects that were part of the exhibit. And then finally, we have these custom label panels, which you'll see in just a moment. And here's a little vignette that shows all 3 elements: the platform, the arch, and the labels that curve with the platform. And color plays an important role as well in helping to delineate the various sections within the exhibit. Here's an example of one of those like 60 pages showing like every single object and its location on the plan. You can see like in architecture set, like the details of the components, how they would be constructed. Everything was unique and custom, showing how video screens are connected to label panels, showing the construction of the half arches. And those were all unique and different because the space was so particular. And then we had a really nice visit to New Project, which is a fabricator in Brooklyn. And we looked at examples of, samples of all of the construction. We also were exploring how the graphic design gets put into the gallery. This was one of the first things that happens, the paint and the design. And then you begin to see the construction and how everything kind of starts to get put in. And very simple elements, but all of them required a lot of work. And to get this seamless was a big challenge. And then the metal elements come in.
It's like this very delicate scrim-like material that punctuates the space. I think you talked about like democracy and equality.
Yeah, I mean, in plan, like every section of the exhibit is equal. So you have sections that have like royal dresses from like the Queen of Qatar or something. And then you have street fashion and protest fashion, where women are talking about this idea of head covering or face covering in more critical ways. And so all of those are kind of dignified and celebrated within the space of the exhibit. And the audience can decide, how they feel about all of these different aspects. So now you're seeing images of the exhibit after it opened, where everything is now complete. And yeah, as designers, as graphic designers and architects, we go from like the 1/32 of an inch all the way up to like the gallery scale. And
this opened briefly before the pandemic set in, and hopefully will reopen after. One of the most moving moments for me was when Waqas's mom came to the opening, and she was just thrilled. And I felt like, wow, it was such a gift for me to see her fine representation in our work.
mm-hmm. And this is vinyl on the fabric. It's a special type of vinyl that's really adheres well to fabric.
So the final project here is called Happy Family Night Market. Essentially a street fair that happened, of course, like pre-pandemic, and is trying to sort of bring New York City together around sort of Asian cultures, the culture of the Asian diaspora. And we're like, what does that mean? It's like, so the night markets from my childhood are like this in Taiwan. It's a raucous, like sort of mishmash of various foods and sort of activities, a lot centered around food, but also culture. And we looked at sort of signage because they asked us to create a visual identity that represented the multiplicity of Asian cultures. This problem of sort of perpetual foreignness with which Asians are looked at, and sort of always like the Chinatown commercialism, something's being sold to you, as much as like sort of Asians should be valued for more than just that. But at the same time, looking at how immigrant cultures survive by sort of embracing this sort of ecstatic and expressive graphic language. And so we were inspired by that, created a series of stickers. The stickers came in 8 different languages, and it became this sort of fun sort of cut and paste identity. And then there was this idea of unfolding, which means that our identities are not two-dimensional, and instead they sort of fold into space, and everything becomes sort of this collage of activity and excitement. And it was just really wonderful to kind of think about how our own cultures could be represented in a way that was that had dignity, but at the same time felt fun and joyful. And I've been learning through working with Waqas that joy is also an operation of justice, and that celebration doesn't undermine sort of struggle. Instead, it maybe helps us heal from it. So this is the actual space that the event was mounted, and here's a mock-up of what we wanted to do. Of course, they didn't have the money to do this, and so we did more modest graphics in select spaces, but it was really fun because unlike some of the museum exhibitions that we tend to do, it wasn't reverent to just kind of like graphics kind of go here at this angle, and they would wrap around sort of various fixtures in the space, and just kind of create this context in this modernist building for kind of a takeover in a guerrilla kind of way.
Yeah, and for me, seeing like my language, Urdu, made visible in a New York space with so many people like buzzing around was really empowering. So that was really cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. Molly, I think you.
Hey, there we go. I was looking for my applause and I wasn't finding it. All right. Thank you so much. And right now, I wonder, let's see. Okay, we'll set it up like this. And we have one question in Q&A from our audience so far. And I'm going to add to that one of my own. So Chelsea Liu says, how do you convince clients against doing something you find problematic? And I want to add to that, I've noticed that you're smiling as you say this. How do you advise that people or that architects and designers question the design brief? Because I think that's what you might be doing.
So in terms of convincing clients against doing something problematic, I think it happens in different layers. And at its most successful, it happens as a calling in, as a conversation. And it's best had in a small group or one-on-one in a phone call. And just sharing like, oh, we don't think that this is good. We think that this might be read as racist, and we know you don't want to do that. Sometimes though, there is, working with institutions and personalities, it doesn't always go like that. It's not that smooth, right? So as a studio, then we have to decide, like, is it worth it for us to take it to the next level? And for us, in terms of our calculation, we say, like, if somebody is doing something explicitly bad, like hurting puppies or similar, then we're going to say no to that. And we will be ready to leave the project if need be. For example, in the Google project, at one point, of course, as a corporation, they're really concerned about how this is going to be read and what people might write about it, and whether or not they're going to be able to, look good. Essentially, all institutions want to look good. So they said, in a kind of a moment of fear and panic, they said, we're just gonna put up quotes of these individuals. We're not gonna talk about history. We're not gonna talk about the history of policing as coming from like slave patrols. We're not gonna talk about the literary language. And then, it's one of us who has to get on the call and be like, we don't think that as a studio we can stand behind a project that doesn't do that because of the following reasons. Like, we always want to have our reasoning very clear. And also that we let them know that, if you did pursue this path, then we would want to step away from the project. And you're welcome to continue and take whatever you have so far. And luckily, that convinced them. And the reasoning, as well as the essentially a threat, what else could it be, like, convinced them, and they said okay. And then we worked together to make sure that we make Google look as good as possible, but also not be afraid of telling the truth. And there have been moments where we've backed out of a project midway in a way, and that's something that we have to be prepared for from the very beginning in the way we structure our contract. We want to make sure that if the project gets canceled midway through, like we still get paid, for the work that we've done. So all of those logistics and ethical questions are kind of synthesized.
I want to add another question. There's a question coming from Facebook Live from Dan LeCompte. And Dan says, in consideration of the first project and presenting these large walls of striking images and text, what were the considerations of interactions, engagement, or immersion beyond passive information and image presentation? Or did the method chosen feel appropriate given the large amount of interaction and events going on at the location?
Yeah, it was kind of like a trade show, like a glorified trade show with an exhibit component. And so from our point of view, like given that there were 6 weeks to get this large, from like start to finish, to get this large organization on board with one vision and to try to get them to just make something that was coherent, we focused a lot on just like graphics that talk to you, and then using the partner stations as sort of and the stage as interactive elements for the visitors. But it's true that like a lot of times graphic design does function in this particular way, especially in the exhibition context, like a big billboard, say like, here are the values, now digest them. And I think that it's something that we sort of bring to every exhibit, how can it be more than that? How, especially in a time where, we're trying to avoid touch and close contact with other people, how can we still facilitate more of an interaction than just reading?
We've got another couple of questions that I'd like to ask. One comes from Catherine Wang, and she says, do you have any advice on being less attached to ideas and concepts that just aren't working out? I think everybody feels.
I mean, like, I'm really attached. So I get really attached to ideas. I get really scared when those ideas have to change. Like especially like mid or late in the project, where like you'll learn something, you're like, oh shoot, like we should redesign this, or like the client says something, it's like, well, okay, we have to be more flexible about our thinking. Generally, we try to point to what's been agreed to so far, and try not to undo a lot of, it's because it's not efficient from a business point of view. But if it really sort of conflicts with what the purpose of the design is, and there is wiggle room, we try to figure out how not to compromise, but still change the design. So like this is coming from Waqas's sort of training at Sana, where they would literally redesign the whole building to suit a new idea, as opposed to like changing one part of it to make it fit. And I think that flexibility, that plasticity, particularly graphic design, is something that ultimately serves us well, which is that like nothing is fixed, right? It's all invented. And so if it is invented, it can be reinvented. And so I think that setting aside good ideas when they don't work is okay, so long as you sort of like, I think, calm that part of yourself that's like, okay, that idea is still going to be there, like it will come up in another project, or I will use it for myself. We will never show this work, and you can take great pride in it even if it never gets built. Yeah.
And I'll just add that within our studio, there is a culture of talking about the work. So whether it's architecture or graphic design, we always want to be able to describe what has been made in design form, and to give reasoning for whether or not it's good and whether or not it's good for this particular project. And that, I think, conversation helps us figure out what's in and what's out, and then later on helps us convince the client as well. But there's, new information, as Andy said, can emerge at a later stage. And in that sense, that conversation has to evolve, and with it, the design has to kind of change.
I'm going to combine two questions that are in the Q&A. One is from Andy Lipnicki, who says, what advice would you give someone who has a voice, like a high school student or at-home mom, but not necessarily the range and richness of design, communication with design skills you have, to make their voice more heard and effective? And I'm going to add to it that there's another anonymous question that says, what would you suggest to high school students who want to pursue their interests in graphic and industrial design?
I think that a lot of what we get paid to do is to assign taste to visuals. or built environments. And I think that could be quite problematic because it assumes that there's like one dominant taste and that there's only one thing that can qualify as good communication. When in fact, like something that you create with no knowledge that expresses an emotion or a message on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, that can be really great design, but not in the classical sense. And so I would just encourage that, like, to pursue both ideas. One is to become well educated in what the history of design is, and to look at like sort of how various designers have either been celebrated or been denounced, and both are interesting for sort of the ways in which they use the communication design skills and try to build a repertoire of those skills that speak to you. At the same time, not put yourself down if you don't have as much education or as much experience. Because I started in sociology, like I was told that I shouldn't be a graphic designer, I should just be a writer, like by multiple people who are really prominent in the field. And so like, and my mom who said that like design takes talent. And so I think that some degree of like not knowing and ignorance about a field can be really helpful, especially at the beginning, like because it helps you challenge what those stereotypes are, what is considered beautiful and what is considered sort of crass or not. I think it's worthwhile to just explore whatever comes to you organically and see how well it communicates, and then modulate based on your experience.
Yeah, and I think, what was I going to say? Yeah, I think that I would just add that there are two different ways of being when you're a designer. One is just being creative and making things, and the other is kind of editing. And the two are very different. And so in the making things component, we make a lot of mistakes, we make a lot of bad design, and then that all gets edited and refined in the next stage. So as much as possible, whether it's somebody at home or somebody who's in high school considering going and studying one of the design fields, I would say increasingly collaboration is so important. So just make a lot of work, even if it's bad. I think just get in the habit of making a lot of work and then checking in with people you trust of what they think, and seeing how you might get better and better based on that feedback.
I think also part of what you both bring to the table is that Andy, you were a sociologist and writer who came to design and had a strong interest in design throughout school that you later pursued in graduate study. And I think that conceptually speaking, the kind of work that you're able to do in isometric is as expansive as it is because you bring these different elements to bear. It's not just one thing.
I think it's also a matter of survival. I mean, like queer people of color are running our own studio, not attached to some well-moneyed institution or like well-moneyed folks. And so it's like, how do you make work in that context where you don't have all the connections to have these clients already, and like you're starting from zero, right? I think like one of the things is basically we took whatever work was honorable that connected with our values, but still like sort of allowed us to survive, and we did a lot of work for startups and a lot of work for things that we don't do today, but like and at the same time like that all built a set of skills and a way of sort of thinking about design that is like flexible and fluid and grounded. And I think that I always fear that sometimes design education could become so elitist that only a couple of people are celebrated, and they're celebrated in very specific ways for making very specific kinds of design. And I'm always interested in sort of the conversations about how we open that up, how we challenge the convention of what's considered valuable.
And in terms of challenging the brief, which I think we can kind of bring back in this discussion, is we do it in a way that includes the client as a collaborator. And we do it even before we get the project in the form of the proposal. So when we do see possibilities, we'll write out, we have the 3 points in our proposal, ways of thinking about the project conceptually. And we try to challenge the client in that early stage, and that usually gets us the project if it's a good match. And if it's not, then we don't get the project. So So I don't think that we have the power or the ability to challenge the brief after getting the project, to surprise the client with like, oh, you asked for a library, but here's like a homeless shelter. We don't do that and we can't do that. But we'll try to convince them beforehand. And then if their actions or their requests go against that initial agreement, then we try to hold up a mirror and get them to do the right thing.
Well, there are two questions that are in the Q&A that hit on exactly what you were just talking about. Andre Benatar said, to add on to the question regarding the design brief, how do you go about demanding the proper amount of time and resources in order to do the necessary research and develop a considerate and empathetic approach? What do you do when the research phase feels too rushed? And then in addition, another attendee said, you spoke about finding ways to work around a budget and other factors that may lead to a compromise in terms of staff and funding. What do they typically look like up front? How do you approach these challenging situations? So I think these questions are both taking on that holding up the mirror and the infrastructural work you have to do as designers.
I think graphic design, even more so than architecture, is a field that people feel like, oh, I can do it myself, or I know somebody who can do it. So it's kind of like water in your hands. It kind of dissipates. So one thing we learned in doing the proposal is to be as explicit as possible about all of the different elements, both in the process and the outcome. Listing everything out is really important. And that helps us both kind of give ourselves a preview of what this project is going to look like, and also give the client an understanding of what it is they're getting that's going to be of value to them. And I guess we learned by doing and by realizing when we made a mistake and budgeted too little time or too little money for a project. And then over time, we became better at, pricing projects.
Yeah, some part of me, like, it's kind of like doing two things at once. One is like not being afraid of asking for, I don't know, like $35,000, $50,000, $70,000, $100,000 for like that project. That's what the market value of the project is, and being confident enough to say that this is what the value is of this thing that I'm going to give you, and being okay with that. So that's one thing that was really hard to learn. Like when you're like, when you're a freelancer or whatever, a couple $1,000 seems like a lot of money for a visual identity, but when you're a firm, you're like, you have to charge like 10 times that in order to survive. And then the other side of it in terms of time is that tends to always be like sort of difficult, right? Because like people always want things quickly and fast. And I think that part of our goal is to be flexible with people's timelines, but with certain limitations. To say that in order for us to do this, you have to give us this at this date. And if that doesn't happen, then there will be a cascading series of delays. And and to be very clear about that up front. I think that frankness is very helpful. Collaborative conversations with people like over the phone that are not sort of, like high key moments in the meeting, in between meetings, can be really helpful. It kind of helps them see you as human beings, like sort of all working together toward a goal, particularly in a pandemic time. And to say like, I had a teacher who, Andrew Fryban, who taught me at RISD, who then sort of helped us get the USAID project, and was collaborating on that project. And one thing he said is just tell the client what you need to do the project. It seems so simple, but like if you just break it down, it's like, okay, here's what I need. And then they'll usually meet you halfway. Like people are usually not inhumane. They're usually like want the project to succeed. They usually want you to like them too. And I think that like, if you could just like see people as human beings, see them as part of institutions where they're facing their own pressures, and then like break it down for them. Like, here's what we can do. Here's how we can work together. Generally, people are really open. Oh, asking for more time. So this is something that like we're really bad at, because like people pleasers, right? Like you want to make the deadline, you want to beat the deadline, like you want to like get it in beforehand, like, but like sometimes it's just like, I don't have enough time in the day to get this done. What do we do? Like, and it's always scary because like, should we ask for more time? Like, is it too late to ask for more time? Like, will we be seen as incompetent? It's never too late to ask for more time. Never, right? If you can make a better presentation with one more day of work and a good night's sleep, like, just ask for it. And I say this about academia too. Like people handing in the thesis late in RISD, like there are no consequences. They still graduate. Like I think that like it's a complete like a white supremacist lie that things need like that there's any emergency to design. There's never an emergency, even if you feel like it in your heart and you've been trained to feel like it. Like it needs to be on, like at this level, at this time. That is all just lies. It takes the time that it takes. You have to honor your own sense of integrity by trying to meet schedules as best you can with your clients. Otherwise, they will fire you. I think at the end of the day, like a day or two here and there, people are generally flexible. Yeah.
We also do a lot of research. I mean, just to give another dimension of this to this conversation, like when we're approached by a new client, now we have a minimum in the studio. Like we can't afford to take on a project that's less than a certain budget just to kind of stay afloat with our team. So we let them know up front. We connect people with freelance designers, that may be able to help them. But then we also do, it's value-based pricing, right? So when we're working with a nonprofit on a scope of work, the price might be different than if you're working with a corporation. So we do research on who else they might be looking at and what might they be charging, and kind of thinking about all of those complex elements, and also like who are the individuals involved. So there's a lot of like behind the scenes research on when we enter projects as well.
So that brings us almost to time. As we're wrapping up, I've got a couple of aphorisms from Andy that I think I want to bring back, which is, it takes the time that it takes. If it is invented, it can be reinvented. I might add to it, if it could be politely questioned, then it's worth politely questioning, so you're starting on equal grounds. And that it is worth doing work that is honorable and true to your values, in order to put something out in the world and do the kind of work that you want to do. So what you see here with Isometric is a studio that and who does just that. And so I just want everybody to please thank Waqas and Andy for joining us today. I only wish it could be in person. Let us hope that that's going to happen sometime soon, maybe later this year. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take good care.